Hello, everybody. Welcome to the January 25th edition of the MU Extension Forage and Livestock Town Hall meeting. My name is Eric Bailey. I'm a state beef nutrition specialist with MU Extension, and I will be serving as the host and moderator for today's presentations. My co-host is Amy Schleicher. She has changed her name to ask questions here in the chat. So if you would like to participate or contribute to the discussion today, feel free to either unmute yourself and jump in once we ask for questions, or if you would prefer to type them in the chat, they can be typed and sent to everybody. Or if you want a direct message, go ahead and send them to ask questions here, and she will read out the questions to the group anonymously. As always, these videos are simulcast to both Zoom and to YouTube, so it's being streamed live on YouTube right now. The purpose of our streaming on YouTube is so that we can host the video on our YouTube channel afterwards. And so if you go to YouTube and search MUIPM in the search bar, you will find our page. All of our videos, I believe we have over 63 videos that are posted on this page now, related to just the forage and livestock town hall. There's also horticulture town halls that are being posted on this page as well. So there's a wealth of information. If you would please go to the page and subscribe. If you subscribe, you'll get alerts when these live streams pop up, alerts when we post new videos. And the more you like and subscribe on our page, the more that we can the more attention our page gets. So I will go ahead and move this on. And as always, we're going to start with a weather report from Dr. Pat Guinan.
Thank you, Eric, and good afternoon, everyone. We have one more week left of January, so what a change from all the warmth we saw in December. Of course, it was our warmest December on record, back well over 100 years. But winter scenarios in Missouri can change abruptly, and that's what we've seen so far for this month. And here in the upper left, we just have a week left, but it's safe to say, considering the temperatures over the next few days, it'll be a colder than average month for January. You can see departures through the 25th of January. Generally colder conditions as you go north. They've had snow cover up in that area of parts of northern Missouri. Those Arctic air incursions have been hitting northern Missouri harder than southern parts of the state. They've been a little bit more moderated in the temperatures this month. Nonetheless, they're running generally 1 to as much as 4 to 5 degrees below normal across northern parts of the state, and warmer, milder, or more seasonal conditions across west, central, and southern parts of Missouri. On the upper right is the precip we've seen so far this month. We really haven't seen a lot across much of the state. The exception to that is southern, southeastern parts of Missouri, where it has been wet. And climatologically, that is what to anticipate during the winter season here in Missouri. Generally drier conditions across northern parts of the state, and a higher likelihood of heavier precip across southern, especially southeastern sections, and that is what has transpired so far for the month. You can see generally south and east of I-44, 2 to over 6 inches here in the Boot Heel, very wet conditions. They've been impacted by some of those systems sliding to our south. What you see here in parts of Carter and Reynolds and Shannon County, that's a radar bias that where they underestimate how much precipitation has fallen. So it's safe to say that those heavier precip above 2 to 4 inches of precipitation in that part of the state. So wetter conditions across southeast Missouri. There was a snow event during the middle part of the month that brought some decent precip across northern parts of Missouri. And so even with 1 inch or more, that is above average for the month of January across northern parts of the state, which is climatologically the driest time of year here in January. Lower left, I think a big concern, look at all the western half of the country. We have a serious situation in regard to drought impacting much of the western half of the U.S. And then I put in the bottom right here some of the percentages when it comes to the topsoil that is reported to be short and very short condition. And you can see across the eastern slope of the Rockies all the way down into Texas, these very dry conditions, soil moisture conditions, as well as the pasture and rangeland conditions. These are the percentages in poor to very poor condition. And you can see from Montana down to Texas, a lot of that pasture and rangeland is just not looking good. Of course, that's residual conditions that we saw last year, and it spilled over into the dry conditions that have continued into this year. So something to really keep an eye on. Hopefully we'll see a snowier condition across the northern plains, the eastern slope of the Rockies, and this drought is only intensifying in parts of the southern plains from Oklahoma down into Texas. So something to keep an eye on. We've been a little bit more fortunate here as you go east with the recent snow event and some precipitation events in December, but knocking on our door to the west is not a really good situation at all, and hopefully we'll see a weather pattern change over the next few weeks or so. This is the forecast over the next few days. That'll take us through the end of the week. You can see high temperature forecast from Tuesday through Friday on the top. Below that are the minimum temperatures. You can see how cold it is with that Arctic air that moved through last night and into today. High temperatures struggling to get into the upper teens across northern Missouri, a little bit more modification as you go through southern parts of the state where they could reach the lower 30s. Low conditions tonight. Look how cold it is up in northern Missouri, single digits to below zero in the northeastern part of the state where we have snow cover still impacting north central, northeastern Missouri. And those temperatures do modify somewhat as we go through the week. A little bit warmer conditions on Thursday. Another cold front is forecast to move through Thursday night into Friday, bringing those temperatures back down again with highs on Friday, generally in the low 20s in northern Missouri into the middle upper 30s across southern parts of the state. I think more modification as we go into Sunday with more seasonable conditions. Generally this time of year, we expect highs in the upper 30s and low 40s and generally lows in the lower 20s. I do want to show the snow cover across the state. You can see again, north central, northeast Missouri, where we had a decent snow event the middle part of January. The snow is still lingering, not a lot of snow, but nonetheless, it shows up on the satellite picture across northeast Missouri all the way up into the upper Midwest. Air temperatures as of about 15 minutes ago, generally in the single digits across northern Missouri, a little bit warmer in quotations and only in the lower 20s here in southern parts of the state. We have a frost line. Soils are frozen at the 2-inch depth across much of the state, with the exception of far southern Missouri. They're generally running in the lower 30s to even the middle 20s across northern parts of the state. Not a lot of precipitation in the forecast over the next 7 days. This is a forecast of precip for the 7-day period ending February 1st next week. You can see little to no precip forecast across much of the country. There is a system that could perhaps impact the East Coast this weekend and in the Pacific Northwest, but in between, very dry conditions over the next week. There are hints at indicating perhaps a pattern change as we go into the month of February. This is actually the 6 to 10 day outlook that'll take us from January 30th through early February. Looks like more of a warmer pattern setting up across the southern plains, colder conditions with Arctic air impacting the north central and Pacific Northwest and the northeastern U.S. But look at all this green anticipated over the next 6 to 10 days. Again, starting January 30th through February 3rd, it looks like an unsettled, stormy weather pattern setting up across much of the northern U.S. That extends down into Missouri, into the southern plains. Hopefully, if this verifies, it will be welcome. We do need more precip, of course, with these existing drought conditions impacting much of the western half of the country. Lastly, this slide does show the hazardous risk over a 2-week period, beginning the first week of February. Something to keep an eye on. It looks like a more unsettled, stormy pattern setting up as we go into the first week of February. Here in the upper left, it is indicating below normal temperatures. There's a moderate risk impacting much of the north central U.S. Could be some very cold conditions for the first week of February across the north central U.S. Potentially for some heavy rain from February 1st to February 3rd. Here you see in the upper right, impacting southeast quarter of Missouri, as well as perhaps some significant snow. So it does look like a strong storm system. Some of the forecast models are indicating a strong storm system to impact much of the middle part of the country. Heavy precip across the south central U.S., heavy snow potential across the upper Midwest and northern plains. And I put a link here where you can follow these outlooks for that first week of February to see if this is going to verify, but something to keep an eye on as we go into the month of February. Eric, that's pretty much a weather report. I'll hand it back over to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Dr. Guinan, for joining us. We always appreciate the weather report that you put together for us. So are there any questions for Dr. Guinan? Okay, hearing none, I will go ahead and move us on into the educational topic for today. Dr. Sarah Kenyon is going to join us. Dr. Kenyon is an agronomy specialist with MU Extension, and she has been tasked with talking about pasture fertilizer options in the face of, rapidly escalating prices that we're seeing these days. So, Dr. Kenyon, take it away.
Many people have been talking about high fertilizer prices, and I was asked to share a little bit about some of the things that I have been talking to farmers about high fertilizer prices. And so my presentation is going to cover just various tips to deal with high fertilizer prices. So remember the basics. And the basics include take a soil test. If you're going to be applying any type of amendment, take a soil test. It's going to pay in a very big way. And if you're going to go to the trouble of doing a soil test, you want to do a good job. Take lots of core samples. You want to get enough core samples to accurately represent the soil that's in your pasture. So do a good job with soil testing. The next thing is apply limestone first. Limestone is a soil conditioner, and it helps to increase the availability of the soil nutrients. So apply limestone first. When it comes to nitrogen, it's considered to be a mobile nutrient. It can move off site. So if you're applying nitrogen, you want to apply it at the time that the crop can respond. And so just prior to a period of rapid growth is considered the ideal time period. When it comes to phosphorus and potassium, these amendments can be applied at any time. They're stable in the soil, so they're not going to move off site like nitrogen tends to do. So they can be applied at any time. When it comes to nitrogen management in particular, the MU Soil Testing Lab recommends 40 pounds of nitrogen to produce 1 ton of cool season grass production. So farmers can use this guideline to pencil out or to budget out the amount of fertilizer, of the amount of nitrogen that they're going to need next to the amount of growth that they anticipate. The problem is growth does not always respond linearly. So if you add 40 pounds, you would expect a ton of forage, but if you add 80 pounds, you might not get 2 tons of forage. And that's because this line curves to it. And the closer you get to, the more you add, you can get to this plateau. And so you may not see quite the response by adding more and more fertilizer. Some colleagues of mine have done a research study to get at that question. In this research study, it's unpublished data, but at Mount Vernon, Missouri, over a 3-year period, they treated cool season grass with either 50 pounds of nitrogen or 100 pounds of nitrogen to see how much of an impact that added nitrogen had. The forage was harvested in May. And so the first 50 pounds gave a pretty good yield response, over 1,000 pounds of forage. But adding that extra 50 pounds only gave a difference on average of just over 600 pounds more. And so even though 100 pounds was added in this treatment, the 50 pounds extra only gave an extra yield response of just over 600 pounds. And so you can see that response is not linear. It does tend to curve over. They were able to share with me some of the economics to go with these numbers. And so you can see here is the various prices of nitrogen fertilizer to see what the cost of that forage is going to be. And so nitrogen at the moment is plus or minus $1 per pound of nutrient. And so to get that extra 600 pounds of growth, it's going to cost over 9 cents to produce that forage. And so there may be more economical feed options versus adding extra nitrogen, depending on your local situation. And so I thought this data was interesting. And I thought that I wanted to share this because, depending on how high fertilizer prices get, there may be supplemental options that are cheaper in your local area. And so one of the things that comes to my mind when I'm talking about managing pastures and managing grazing situations is how we utilize the forage does matter. If nitrogen costs $1 a pound, then the cost of forage is going to be approximately 5 cents per pound. But the way we graze, animals may not consume the entire forage that's available to them. If your grazing utilization rate is 50%, for example, then the cost of the feed increases to 10 cents per pound. And so grazing management really does pay for itself when fertilizer prices are high. And confining the animals to smaller areas and moving them more frequently does increase that utilization rate and can make the forage grown a little bit cheaper. So utilization does matter, especially when fertilizer prices are high. Utilization rate matters when you're feeding hay also. It's January, so most folks are still feeding hay. If hay is $80 per ton, then the cost per pound of feed is 4 cents. But if we don't have a good hay feeding setup and our utilization isn't quite as high, then the cost of the feed increases to 6 cents per pound. So utilization does matter. And so we want to think about our systems, how we're grazing, how we're feeding, and find areas to improve so that we're getting the most forage into the livestock as we can. So sort of to switch gears and to talk about it in a different way, rotational grazing does pay. Management intensive rotational grazing, we teach this at our Missouri grazing schools. And generally in these systems, we will have increased yield and we have increased grazing efficiency. The animals are consuming or utilizing more of the forage that's on offer. In these systems, because we're rotating the animals more frequently and confining them to a smaller area, we do a better job with our manure management. And manure can be a good source of fertilizer and it can add to the overall nutrients that are on the farm. And so the nutrients excreted by the livestock can add to the increased yield in a management intensive rotational grazing system. So rotational grazing does pay. The way that you manage your livestock can improve the overall fertility on the farm over time. The top bar is one paddock of a 3 pasture rotation system. So in this system, the animals are being rotated between 3 different pastures, but they're spending more time in each individual paddock. And, so it's a slower rotation process. Whereas this bottom picture, it's one paddock of a 24 pasture rotation. So the paddocks are smaller in this scenario, and the animals are being rotated from paddock to paddock a little bit quicker. They're not spending as much time in a paddock, and the paddock is being rested longer. So a faster rotation here, a slower rotation here. So in this slow rotation, where the animals have access to a larger, wide open area, the nutrients that are excreted by the livestock, it builds the fertility slower. So the darker the bar, the more nutrients that are in the pasture. So in this area, they're confined to a smaller area, so it's going to build faster because there's more manure put back on the system. So to put it a different way, if you are continuously grazing your fields, it can take you 27 years to get 1 manure pile per square yard. The more often you rotate your animals, the more manure that gets put back on the grazing system. And over time, that will add to your fertilizer and have a big impact on the overall fertility on your farm. And so that's why we say grazing management pays. If you're rotating your animals every other day, every 2 days, it'll take you just 2 years to get 1 manure pile per square yard. And so in this scenario, you'll have more nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium going into the system. So feeding hay, grazing management, you really want to think about how you're feeding hay and how you're grazing so that you're enhancing the manure that's distributed on your farm. In regards to hay feeding in particular, you want to consider how and where you're feeding hay. You want to regularly move feeders and move feeding areas, and you don't want to use the same pasture for supplemental feeding every year. You want to rotate between those so that each area has access to nutrients. This research study shows an example of that. In this study, animals were either fed by using a stationary ring, a hay ring that was moved periodically, or the hay was fed by unrolling. The green dots are the animal locations where the animals spent their time. They were fitted with GPS collars, and so they were able to record the location. And so in the scenario where there was a stationary hay ring, the animals spent most of their time up near the hay where the feed was. They spent very little of their time grazing the rest of the pasture. So most of the manure ended up being concentrated in this particular area. Even though in this scenario where the hay ring was moved periodically, you still see very large clusters of where the animals spent their time. And so the manure and the nutrients are going to be clustered in those areas as well. And if you compare that to where hay was unrolled, you can see there's a couple clusters, but by and large, the animals were tracked over the entire area. And so therefore the manure was distributed evenly over the entire paddock system. And this system will give us higher yield. It'll increase the phosphorus and the potassium in the system over time. And so we do recommend unrolling hay for those reasons. You can do the same thing with your grazing management. It looks a little different, but this is stockpiled tall fescue. This line right here is where an electric poly fence was, and this picture was taken once the poly fence was removed. The animals were allowed to graze, and this is what it looked like after the fact. And so you can see the manure is very evenly distributed over the entire pasture. And so confining your animals to a smaller space for a short period of time and then moving them to a new paddock or a new break can help build nutrients over time because the manure gets excreted evenly over the pasture system. So some other things to think about, you also need to be thinking about how much forage you intend to grow, how much you need to grow to feed your livestock. Do you have gaps in the forage system? And then how do you intend to fill in those gaps? Managing forage, I like to think about managing forage as supply versus demand. Your fresh forage, the grazing forage is your supply. You can also have hay or other supplemental feed. And then your demand is your livestock. They need to eat forage. They have a demand for forage. And so I like to think about forage management as supply versus demand. One way to track supply versus demand is by preparing a pasture growth budget. And so you can manage supply by monitoring your forage through the grazing season. Here's your list of forages, the number of acres, and the animal unit months per acre. And then you can simply chart how much forage is available each month of the year. You can then have a separate chart showing your demand. You'd list your animals out, the numbers of each of those animals, and then you would equate that on an animal unit basis, and then chart that through the year. You may wean calves in the fall. And so you may add a line down the road. And then you can compare your supply versus demand to see where your deficits are and where your surpluses will be. This is just one way to help you visualize and chart your forage production versus your demand, your livestock demand. Another way that people can help manage supply and demand is by a grazing wedge. You can download the grazing wedge from the Missouri website. But the grazing wedge, it's more visual, compared to the Excel spreadsheet, but you would just measure your paddocks and then line them up from the greatest availability to the least availability, and it should follow this target cover line or this wedge shape. And so you can see areas where you're going to have too much forage and areas where you might have some gaps. Both of these options allow you to make decisions ahead of time so that you're not caught making decisions unprepared. And I have found in times of drought, in times of high forage supply, in times of high fertilizer prices, any type of stress management, when things are hard, defaulting to pasture measurements, really helps fine tune the management of the entire system. So I'm a big fan of monitoring forages for that reason. There's lots of different ways to monitor your forage stands. In grazing school, we talk about the grazing stick. And so I think in 2022, it's a good time to bring the grazing stick out of the closet and start measuring pastures. If you're out there measuring pastures, not only do you have data on how much it's growing and how much forage you have on offer, but just simply going out there and looking at your paddocks on a regular routine basis, makes you better prepared to make those decisions. If you might be measuring forage, but you get a better sense of how the entire system is responding if you're going out there and taking a look. So I know that farmers don't generally like to do this, but I have found that in times of stress, managing your pastures, measuring your pastures and then making management decisions to follow up really does help to fine tune the management, and it makes the decisions that are made a little bit better, a little bit more powerful. You're making it with some authority, some data. You have some data behind it, so I think in times of crisis, it is a good idea to measure your forage. You also want to consider when to apply nitrogen. You do want to apply nitrogen when the crop is rapidly growing to get a yield response. Most people will apply nitrogen in March to maximize this natural growth peak for cool season grasses like fescue. But for pastures, you may want to delay that application until early May. And so rather than maximizing this growth peak, you're going to extend this growth peak out into the summer months. That could be a way to fill in some of this gap in the summertime months as well. The other thing to keep in mind is this black line represents the herd feed requirement. And early spring, fescue tends to outgrow the herd requirement. And so you may not need to apply nitrogen in March unless you're cutting hay. Otherwise, you can delay that application to get more forage in the summer months. And so it's really important to think about where you need that forage and where to apply the nitrogen to get that response. This topic was covered last week very extensively, so I'm not going to talk about it a lot, but legumes, red clover, white clover, lespedeza, sun hemp, they contain relationship with rhizobia bacteria that fix nitrogen. And so they're essentially providing free nitrogen to the grass crop. But if you have significant legume in your stand, you do not want to apply commercial nitrogen fertilizer sources. The more nitrogen that you add to the system, the less legume you'll have in the stand over time. So if you have legumes in your stand, you want to apply no nitrogen or a very small amount if you can't get away with zero nitrogen. The other thing is you need to understand crop removal. The way the university soil test recommendations work is they give a recommendation to provide enough nutrients to meet the needs of the crop, and then a little bit of fertilizer extra for buildup. And so if fertilizer type prices are high and you're wanting to save on fertilizer, you can remove this buildup rate and just put down what the crop is taking off. You won't be building your soil, but you won't be depleting your soil either. So this could be a strategy, at least to maintain your soils. It's also important to understand that pastures versus crops and hay ground have different removal rates. In a hay situation, we're fertilizing the hay ground and the fertilizer goes into the crop. We harvest the crop and then feed it back on the pasture. In a pasture situation, the animals are eating the pasture and they're recycling those nutrients back onto the ground, as manure. And so pasture situations, we call those a balanced system because the nutrients are going back on the paddock. And so you may consider on your hay ground, it's a good idea to feed hay back in those areas so you're putting some of the nutrients back during the winter months. So consider those things when you're applying your fertilizer to help balance your system. This is a table that shows some of the removal rates. You do want to put back what is removed, but again, you may be able to save some fertilizer dollars by not applying that buildup period. Some soils may need the buildup. If you're on a very low testing soil, you may need to add some for buildup. But if you're in that maintenance period, that medium to high area, on your forage test, you may not need the buildup, or you may be able to build up at a slower rate. So you can use these removal rates to calculate how much to put back without that buildup period. The other thing to consider is that when you purchase hay, you are bringing nutrients from somebody else's farm to your place. Tim Schnockenberg sent this slide and I thought it was a good one to use. And so in November of 2020, the fertilizer value, the nutrient value in a 900-pound tall fescue bale was $21. But with fertilizer prices increasing in December of 2021, a year later, that same hay bale, the fertilizer value is now $49. So you may be able to bring in nutrients from somebody else's farm by purchasing hay to use on your own place. And so that's something to consider. The other thing to consider is that when you are purchasing fertilizer, you do want to purchase it on pound of nutrient basis. People will talk to me about blends and ratios. And an example is that they've applied 200 pounds of 312. And, I don't know, what does that mean? It's better to calculate how much nitrogen, how much phosphorus, how much potassium on a per pound basis, and it allows you to compare from one fertilizer plant to the next. It allows you to get that better rate. And it allows you to really know, what you're purchasing and the cost of that. And then use your soil test to apply the correct amount. And I think this is a tricky thing. Fertilizer dealers, they're selling blends. They have a product that's in a bin and they're selling blends. And so they like to sell it in this way. But it does make it hard to know if you're getting the right amount, for one thing, and if you're getting the right price, the best price. So do ask them for the price per pound of nutrient or calculate it yourself to get the best deal. The other thing is there are consequences to foregoing fertilizer. Obviously, if you forego fertilizer, you'll have reduced forage production or reduced yield. Oftentimes, we'll have to add supplements to offset the lack of forage production. But adding range cubes, adding corn gluten, adding these other blends, these other supplements does increase our cost of production. And so there are some scenarios where they may be cheaper, but there are other scenarios where they may not be the best fit. And so I think it's important to really spend time this year calculating, how much forage yield you can get per pound of fertilizer versus the cost of the supplement. The other thing is when you forego fertilizer, you have reduced persistence of desirable species. And this can lead to increases in weed and brush problems. And so even though you think it might not be a big deal to skip fertilizer this year, next year you may lose your clover out of those paddocks, or you may lose some of the orchard grass or some of the other desirable species, and then have an overabundance of weed and brush. And so this is a negative consequence as well. And then lastly, you may have reduced forage quality if you're not fertilizing your fields correctly, which again could lead to increased use of supplements, which in some cases may be more expensive than purchasing fertilizer. And so there's a lot of things to talk about in terms of pasture nutrients and ways to manage nutrients on the farm. These were just a few of the ideas that I had with the time allowed. But I think this is a situation that we're going to be talking about, for a little bit of time. But that's what I have. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, Sarah, for joining us. Amy, are there any questions?
Yeah, we did have one come in. The question is, can we get full benefit of nitrogen from legumes this year?
So if you plant legumes this year, there is a lag phase from when you plant to when they will fix nitrogen. It takes a little bit of time for the rhizobia bacteria to develop that relationship with the legume. And then once that relationship develops, they have to start fixing nitrogen to feed the clover plant. And then once they have that extra, so to speak, that will go to the companion grass. So the first year production of nitrogen, we generally consider that to be a little bit lower than the subsequent years. I think they presented this last week, and so I didn't show that information, but there is that lag phase, and the first year is a little bit lower.
Sarah, in Tim Schnackenberg's analysis of the value of fertilizer that's in a bale of hay, which nutrients were factored into it?
He's looking at all three: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium.
And have they all escalated in price? I know nitrogen is catching all the attention at this point, but have
all of them, yes, all of them have increased, but nitrogen is the one that is increased by the most, but phosphorus and potassium have increased as well. Yes.
How about lime? Has the price of lime increased?
No, not in my area. It has not. Limestone is still the same price. And so limestone really is one of the things to apply first. It's one of the basic steps. So it may be a year to apply limestone and let that work into the soil so that more nutrients are then available to the plant.
Sarah, we did have another question come in. Let me scroll up here. The question was, did you show how to calculate the pounds of nutrient in fertilizer?
No, I didn't. I didn't show how to calculate the pounds of nutrient and fertilizer. I was concerned about time. Usually when you call the fertilizer plant, you can ask them to do that for you. There are some tools. Colorado has a good guide sheet on fertilizer calculations. And then Kansas University has a really good spreadsheet that you can use to calculate fertilizer. And so I just barely covered it because I was concerned about time.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you. We did have another one come in for Southern Missouri. What is the latest you would say that poultry litter could be applied in the spring on a fescue hayfield and still see an adequate response from the nitrogen?
In manure, manure like poultry litter, only part of the nitrogen is available instantly, and the rest is slowly distributed through the year. You still want to apply it, to have the nitrogen impact, you still want to apply it during that rapid growth phase of your crop. And so that rapid growth, or just prior to the rapid growth phase. And so you still want to apply it in early spring or as close to early spring as you can, so that you're getting that nitrogen on that rapid growth phase. So you're capturing most of that yield. For the slow release part, it'll be available later. And so if you're looking at a later cutting or a fall cutting, you could put it down later and count on that slow release. But if you're counting on a spring hay cutting, I would say it needs to be applied during that rapid growth phase.
Any more questions for Sarah before we wrap up today?
Eric and Sarah, I did want to share, one of our agronomists on the in the meeting today shared the links that Sarah had referred to. And so I'm going to put those into the chat. So those will be available. And then I also wanted to ask, Sarah, can you expand more on how, I think in your last slide, you talked about how forage quality could be impacted. Could you talk about that a little bit more?
We talk about how the forage must be fed before it'll feed the livestock. And, if there's a gap or deficiency in your forage, then there could potentially be a gap in your livestock. Nitrogen can have an impact on crude protein, but generally, you want to harvest at the correct stage. I think that quality is sort of indirectly related, to fertility, but it all plays together, to some extent, and so it is indirectly related, I would say.
Okay, it looks like those links are up in the chat. So anybody who wants to save those or click them right quick before we end the show, so that you can have access to that content, feel free to. But Sarah, thank you for joining us today. Really appreciate that presentation. I'm going to go ahead and wrap us up for today. Again, thank you all for watching. We really appreciate y'all joining us. We are going to have another town hall, I believe, on the second week of February. Be looking for an announcement there. I believe Jordan Thomas will be joining us to discuss breeding or bull management and breeding soundness exams and issues around bull fertility. So have a good afternoon, everyone.